Hi guys, and welcome to another video. Today I have goblins for you, in particular Grixis Midrange Goblins and Mono Red Aggressive Goblins, which is the deck you have in front of you here. So I'm gonna start with this one, and then after I'm doing the Grixis Midrange version. Alright, so you have the A-Akki Ronin at the 1 mana spot. This card in particular is great to prevent you from Screw and Flood, which I think is really important and maybe something that might be overlooked in a aggressive deck. The same role plays the 2 of Crystal Grotto, which can just put lands on the top from your library to the bottom, or just helps you to find your land. And obviously Fable of the Mirror Breaker plays a similar role, which then on turn 3 can have a similar effect, which I think is actually one of the most important things for a deck like this, just to really be able to curve out and play your powerful cards. So I think the A-Akki Ronin is really good for that, and of course this is only available in Historic and Alchemy because it got buffed by the, I think, last balance patch. Also worth noting, this effect can stack. Let's say you have 2 or 3 A-Akki Ronins in play and you attack with one of your warriors. By the way, the Scamp is a warrior, the Fuseling and the Hordemaster as well. Then you basically get all the triggers from each Ronin you have in play, which can be really nice to just filter away lands or maybe find whatever you might be looking for. Then we have 4 copies of Cacophony Scamp. This is a new card from Phyrexia 1. This reminds maybe of, I think the name is Goblin Fireblade Charger. So basically when this card dies, it deals damage to any target equal to its power, and you can also choose if you get to connect to the opponent with it to sacrifice it and then proliferate. So sacrificing it of course triggers the second ability to deal the damage, which is in this deck potentially pretty decent with a bunch of lords. We have technically 12 in there in Hordemaster, Collation Construct and Battle Cry Goblin. You can also copy like a Construct or a Hordemaster with the Fable, which is something to keep in mind. And maybe if you're up against Vat, Anvil, Atraxa, Reanimator, the Trashmaster will also come in play. So this can actually function as a sort of 1 mana removal spell in creature form, which is of course really nice to have access to in a Goblin tribal deck. And also the Proliferate can be relevant. Let's say you have a Fable of the Mirror Breaker which you want to speed up, or more importantly maybe the Exuberant Fuseling. This is a 1 mana trample goblin that gets +1/+0 for each oil counter on it, and it enters the battlefield with an oil counter, so it's gonna be a 1/1 on base. But it also says whenever another creature or artifact is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you get to put an oil counter on it, and then it basically grows for +1/+0 for each time for that happening. So only the power gets increased, but it's still really good in an aggressive deck, right? And it has trample. And then ways to trigger this is the Fable of the Mirror Breaker Goblin Shaman token that makes a artifact treasure, or just each goblin that gets removed by the opponent. So you're playing an aggressive deck, you're playing really good goblins that the opponent wants to remove. So this actually does get triggered quite often, and I think is really good to have access to as a 1 mana creature in your tribal goblin deck. And of course this works with the Kiki Chiki token being sacrificed at the end step, like Squee tokens that the opponent might want to jump, or Battle Cry Goblin tokens. So yeah, there's just so many ways to have these, a creature basically dies triggers going off, which is in particular cool with tokens, right? Because you don't always have that. Often the text is whenever a non-token artifact or creature, but the Fuseling doesn't care about that. Alright, then let's maybe continue with the Battle Cry Goblin here. This is a really powerful goblin that also sees play in Historic. On 2, he's basically a 2/2, which is not too impressive, but this card especially shines in the late game because you then can pump all the mana you have laying around, also like treasures from like the Fable token, to then pump your team up a lot. And then when you attack with creatures with total power 6 or more, then you get to create a 1/1 Goblin creature token that enters the battlefield tapped and attacking. And this basically can have very explosive like mid and end game moments where you can just win out of nowhere. And if you top deck this card, the game can just be over. So this is a really good 2 mana goblin and a payoff for the deck, I think. Then another great payoff for the deck at the 2 mana slot is the Rundvelt Hordemaster. This is your 2 mana lord basically, and it says whenever a goblin dies, you basically pick the top card of your library, you exile it if it's a land that's decent in the late game, and if it's a goblin, you may cast it. A downside in this deck with this is that you have 4 Correlation Constructs and 4 Fable of the Mirror Breaker, and also 3 removal spells in a sense in the form of the Traumatic Prank here's. By the way, in the beginning I tried Memphis Enthusiasm. I think this is also totally main deckable. In the end I just was pivoting to Prank because this is just a very unfair card, and we are playing an aggressive deck where this is best. But yeah, unless you hit one of those cards, you get to, as I said in the late game, get rid of a land or just get to hit 1 or more goblins. Yes, more, because if they, let's say, wipe your board, then each goblin dying this way, also the Hordemaster itself, triggers this ability, which is obviously pretty good to have, especially, let's say, if you have 2 Hordemasters in play. And this also notably counts for tokens. So if you attack with Squee and they profitably block one of your goblin tokens, then you still get to have this trigger. The next up at the 2 mana slot we have the Goblin Moral Sergeant. This I take out often in game 2 or 3, especially on the draw, especially against the aggressive deck, because you want to bring answers and not playing haste creatures on defense, right? Because they obviously have a quite significant advantage by being on the play. But if you are on the play, or if you are in game 1 versus a, let's say, mid-range deck, because we are playing best of 3 here, right? Then this is of course a nice card to have access to in a more aggressive slanted deck. So this is a 2 mana haste creature that has Enlist, and whenever you enlist another creature, you may choose to conjure a duplicate of the creature into the top 5 cards of your library at random. And then the cool part about this is that the duplicate then perpetually gets +1/+0 and haste. So let's say if you just played your 1-drop as a Scamp and then follow it up with a Sergeant, you get to basically put a Goblin Guide, like a 2-powered haste creature for 1 mana, in the top 5 of your library. And this is in particular, of course, pretty neat with the Scamp by increasing its power. But of course this is good with most goblins, just giving a Battle Cry Goblin haste and the +1 power is quite relevant, and in particular like having multiple Hordemasters is pretty cool. So I think this just quite makes the cut, but I think this might just be the weakest card in the deck. So this ends up often being one of the first options when I put out cards from the main deck by sideboarding. Then at the 3 mana slot, Fable of the Mirror Breaker. Probably don't have to say too much about this. The in particular cool thing with this in this deck, of course, is that it creates a goblin token and is a goblin itself, like the reflection of Kiki Chiki, and has in particular, as mentioned before, great synergy with the Coalition construct. So this is just another great lord in this deck. The downside, as also mentioned before, might be that you have less goblins in your deck. And also maybe worth noting, if you have multiple constructs and you play one out, the other construct in your hand, or the other constructs, then are not yet goblins, because when it enters the battlefield you may choose the type and then it becomes that type. But in the hand and the library it's not yet a goblin, but you still get all the payoffs for it being a goblin on the battlefield, which is really nice, like getting buffed by Hordemaster or getting haste and the buff from the Battle Cry Goblin. And of course multiples can buff each other on the battlefield. And yeah, being able to copy it with Fable is really nice. And of course, one of the biggest upsides is that the +1/+1 effect is perpetual. So even if they get rid of the Coalition construct, which they then of course no longer are incentivized to do so, you still get to keep your buff, which in particular can be pretty cool with a card like Squee, Dubious Monarch. So this cool fella you might also probably already know. Squee is already a strong card in usual aggressive decks, but of course here he makes a ton of sense. Being able to generate a 1/1 Goblin token that's tapped and attacking each time it attacks is really nice. Of course he and his little friends get often buffed by the other goblins, and being able to escape it basically for 4 mana by exiling 4 other cards of the graveyard is pretty decent as well. And then as your last card, as also mentioned before, you have the Traumatic Prank. This is basically your removal spell in a sense. Here in this deck, as I said, you can probably quite nicely also run Memphis Enthusiasm, which has also decent synergy with haste creatures in general, but in particular the Scamp maybe to power up its power, or you can maybe even run Brittle Blasts in the main deck if you're quite scared of Sheldreds. That's the reason why it's in the sideboard though. But I think the Traumatic Prank is just very universal in an aggressive deck. It deals a ton of damage, it removes the ability from a creature, in particular better for a more expensive creature, right, to block, and then it deals 1 damage to the opponent. if the creature remains on the battlefield on each of their upkeeps. So this really just gives you some reach, right? Because the creature then pings the opponent on each upkeep and you get to attack with the creature too, so it also deals damage in a sense. And maybe the creature has some cool effects, like maybe you get to yoink a reflection of the Kiki Chiki or a Crucius, then you get to either copy one of your good things or get the discard and go for Ambitious or Expedient at the end step, trigger going off, or just another good creature. Of course, the more expensive the better, so this card is just very good and these of course already play in an aggressive other deck in the format like Mono Red. And then at the mana base, as also mentioned before, you have Crystal Grotto, which is, I think, very good in a deck like this because you are playing a mono-colored deck and can afford to run it. I usually even go up to as far as 3 copies, but here I have 11 1-drops and sometimes you want to go 1-drop, 1-drop, 1-drop. So I stuck to 2 for now, but yeah, this is just really important, being able to hit your mostly 3rd land drop or just getting rid of extra lands on the top of your library. It's just like life-saving. I think this is a lot better than the Foundry or whatever it's called, to maybe get an additional 2 damage in the late game. Like, you have so many ways to spend your mana in general, not always, but in general. You can, for example, also like channel a Sokenzan for not too cheap in this deck because we only play 1 Squee. You can escape Squeeze, you can copy things with Fable, and most importantly, of course, you can pump all your mana into Battle Cry Goblin, so most of the time you don't have the mana, and even if you would have it, you probably don't want to spend it on a Foundry anyways. And sometimes, of course, you would, but I think this cry is just so much more often life-saving. Being able to curve out and not to flood, I think, is more important in each deck, but also especially in a aggressive deck. Then in the sideboard we have 2 copies of Unlicensed Hearse, 2 copies of Goblin Trashmaster. Those 4 I would bring in against Anvil, Vat, Atraxa, Reanimator, kind of that deck, because they play a ton of artifacts. So this is, I think, one of the only good decks in the meta where you want to bring the Trashmaster, which of course is nice in the deck because it is a Goblins deck. Has also like small synergy with the Scamp if you want to sacrifice it, and it buffs it, of course. And then Hearse I also like to bring against Grixis. Grixis, in the games at least that I played, was surprisingly popular, and which also runs the Corpse Appraisers. And I think also in this version it's one of their best cards, and of course often they have them, but if they don't have Fable and Crucius, you can just really screw them by not being able to cast their relevant 3-drop. I mean, they could cast it as a 3-3, but they really don't want to do that then. And I think it's really worth bringing it because that card can really beat you, especially if they're on the play. And then you, by the way, take out the 2 Surgeons, especially if you are on the draw. It's just not impactful enough, I don't think. It's just a 2-powered haste creature, and the 1 toughness in particular makes it very vulnerable to a card like Molten Impact. Then you have some Twinshot Snipers, Flame Blast Bolt, the Strangle, and the Brotherhood's End. They are all meant to be against aggressive decks. Brotherhood's End in particular versus very aggressive decks like Mono Red. On the draw, on the play I would not bring it. The rest I would just still bring. Twinshot Sniper is always nice versus aggressive decks. It's also quite decent to hard cast it for 4 mana, to be able to have a 2-3 reach body, especially the reach versus a card like Phoenix Chick can also be maybe relevant even if it gets the +1 counter from being brought back from the graveyard. And then of course you can copy this with Fable of the Mirror Breaker, or more specifically Reflection. And then Flame Blast Bolt, of course, has the upside of being able to exile cards, which can be quite relevant, for example, a Squee. And it also has the upside if you play against, like, I'm making Mono Red as an example here, but it's the most prevalent deck. Of course, this is true for most aggressive decks. Like, you can also be up against Poison, and then it's pretty good to have an instant speed 1 mana card available. And in particular, if you are on the play, you would still run this and don't have a 1-drop, you can then pass to their turn and still have interaction if they play a good 1-drop. Or let's say you're up against Mono Red, they start with Kumano and then you have a Strangle in hand. It's not gonna do too much, and that's not that nice if you don't have another 1-drop, which you can play alternatively. But if you have a Flame Blast Bolt and let's say they play a Big Spender or any 1-drop with 1 toughness, you then can still get rid of it, even if they get the +1 counter with Kumano. So I think this is quite nice to have access at the 1 mana spot when it comes to removal. And then the Enthusiasm I put in there in particular versus like Raffine decks, just to have a 4 mana answer, but it's still of course good in the deck because it buffs your creatures, but I would resort to the other removal spells that I just mentioned in particular versus quite aggressive decks. This being 2 mana and nothing else, then a buff is probably not quite enough on the draw, I think. And then you of course have Brittle Blast. This is pretty much where it's like Sheldred. And then I have Oops, come here. Then I have one Goblin Influx Array as like a value card versus very interactive decks. I usually do not love to play this card. I tried it obviously in the deck, also quite a bit in the other Grixis deck. But the thing is, yes, it's nice if you get the Chieftain. Yes, it's very nice if you get the Prospector. But the rest, like, there's a couple good ones in there. There's also like a Battle Cry Goblin, I think, but you have 15 and you get to get a random one. You get to conjure a random Goblin at the end step into your hand. It's a 4-mana enchantment. Yes, you get the reduction, but if you don't have Goblins to be reducted at, I'm not sure about this card. I think it's definitely decent. Definitely an option to put in your deck. I put it in the sideboard because I don't think it's impactful enough in this kind of deck, at least, because we are an aggressive deck. And if you play a mid-range version, which I come to now, then I think it's a lot better to play the following card. The following card being Kindred Discovery. So this is a 5-mana enchantment. This is, by the way, one of the 3, I think, only creature tribal payoffs which you have access to in Alchemy. But yeah, this basically lets you choose a creature type, and then whenever a creature you control of the chosen type enters the battlefield or attacks, you draw a card. That's really nice with all the rather cheap goblins being able to enter the battlefield, but maybe more importantly, that are attacking. Yes, also the creature tokens that get to attack or enter the battlefield, that also triggers, get to tend to draw a ton of cards, which is actually quite hard to beat for most decks if this thing sticks around on the battlefield for just a bit, basically, because you get to keep chaining goblins together and you basically just run away with the game with an immense amount of card advantage. So I'm actually quite high on that card, but it's only true if you can cast it reasonably. Like with reasonably, I mean turn 4. You have Black Market Connections as a one-off, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, and then Crucius himself, the Titan of the Waves. So the sick thing about Crucius, often, not always, but often, but also in this deck, is that you get to use it as a kind of a tutor card in a sense, because if you get rid of a 3-drop, you always will get your 4 or 5-drop. So that's the reason why I don't play more of Kindred Discovery in the main deck. I tried multiples, but there's not really a reason to, because you don't really want a second one, because then you might actually run danger of milling yourself. And getting Grixis Command is not bad either. Like, this is a quite mid-rangey version already, so a card like this I think is very good to have. And the problem with Kindred Discovery can be 2 things. First, on the draw in particular, you can't just lose it to invoke Despair. That's the reason why I tried to bring as many other enchantments in the deck as possible that still have great synergy with goblins, and what better enchantment than to play than Fable and Black Market Connections. But of course you would still play Fable, but that's the reason why the Black Market Connections kind of is in there. But the great thing about Black Market Connections still, of course, is that you get to create the treasure token to then also ramp into one of those 5-drops if you just have them in hand. And it's just a great card in general if you are the deck that applies the pressure. And in best of 3, you get more away with paying the life. And you can just always choose to just only pay 1 life and get to create the treasure token with the sell contraband there. And if you haven't noticed yet, the 3rd option obviously allows you to create a shapeshifter token with Changeling, and Changeling then makes the creature into a goblin. But you want to be careful with this card, because opponents, even like mid-rangey decks, can deal quite some damage even out of nowhere. There's like Invoke, they can hasten things with Fable, they can destroy your board and then you attack you for a bunch, and you have to still pay at least 1 life each turn, which is something to keep in mind. But yeah, that's maybe a way to protect the Kindred Discovery from Invoke. And then another great card against it is Sheoldred, of course, and that's a reason also why I have in this more mid-rangey approach go for the Throats here in the deck. But it's of course still a very good card in the deck. Like, there's a ton of like Crucius going around in best of 3, like Yazils, Raskus, Kikichikis, so you will find a target for that. But I probably don't have to tell you that if you like mid-range decks already. I usually don't play that much mid-range, but yeah, in this deck I think it makes a lot of sense, because Sheoldred really can screw the cool Kindred Discovery idea here of the deck. But then of course you also have the Gix command, which is what you hit by 50% when you pitch a 3-drop, ideally of course a Squee, to the Crucius. But then the Gix command can technically get rid of an opposing Sheoldred, which is of course always the first thing to do. So I think it's quite nice to get this. And since we are playing a more mid-range deck, I think this is just a great card in general, being able to sort of like clear an overwhelming board of the opponent, but also importantly to note, because if you get this with Crucius, then the next step or next idea is of course then to pitch another 2 or 3 drop to then maybe get the Kindred Discovery for sure. But if they remove your Crucius, this then might not work of course anymore, because you only have 1 copy of it in the deck. But Grixis command also allows you to get 2 creature cards from your graveyard, also of course Crucius, which then maybe gives you a way to find it then again. And then the rest of the deck is quite similar, so I'm not going over each card here again. It's just really like the previous deck, but since we have like less buff effects, I only have 3 scamps. I think the card is still quite good. Of course, we still have those 8 4-drops to maybe buff it, and those 8 4-drops is usually how you win the game. They are, I think, just strong enough by themselves. And yeah, I think this is a very good deck to run in best of 3 in Alchemy. Also in particular, you have access to more Sideboard cards, of course. The red ones are still quite similar, and you have the 2 unlicensed hers. And I haven't mentioned this, but of course if you play Crucius, and I think this is sort of a must in each Crucius deck in Alchemy best of 3 anyways, maybe also Historic, but probably Alchemy for sure, is to, run 1 copy of Elish Norn, Mother of Machines. So this card is in there because it is a silver bullet against Esper Midrange, which I think is also one of the best decks in Alchemy best of 3. And their deck really consists of mostly EDB creatures, like pretty much almost each great creature in the deck other than Raffine is an EDB creature, and you can just really win by casting this on turn 4. So that's why she is in there in the sideboard. Of course, you can still cast her for the white mana with the treasure, and you just often really get her off Crucius, and you have ways to make treasures with Fable and Black Market connections as well. And then also maybe different here is the black cards. I have 1 Grim Wanderer in here, which I usually like to bring against like mid-range decks. And then I take out an additional Scamp, because as I mentioned before, it is not as good in this deck than in the other. And the like Chund and Grixis deck in particular don't have that much 2 toughness creatures other than Fable. Like I haven't seen Harvester that much surprisingly in Alchemy, but it makes sense. There's so many other great cards to run, like Undercity Plunder or something like that. So I'm not too high on the Scamp when it comes to like value or removal in a sense. So I think this card is quite nice versus like mid-rangey decks after Sideboard, because of course they have a ton of removal. You have 4 Go for the Throats, you have tokens dying, so I think this downside, because you cannot cast it unless a creature died this turn, is quite easy to overcome versus a mid-rangey deck, and it's just a 2 mana 5/3, and in particular also versus Grixis, this allows you to play around easier around a card like Make Disappear, which is something really nice I think to keep in mind. And then the Splatter Goblin is versus like very aggressive decks with like 1 toughness creatures like Mono Red as well. It's just nice to have access to goblins as your sideboard cards. I think especially because of Hordemaster, because in this deck you don't have like a lot of goblins, and then you get at least a little higher chance of maybe hitting a goblin from the top of your library with its ability. But yeah, this is the second version of goblins that I tried to build and tested in the arena on the Mythic Ranked ladder successfully. I think both of these decks are very good in their own way. I also tried another version of the deck before that. The sideboard is quite similar, it's not updated, so I'm gonna close it. So in here I have the Goblin Influx array. So as I mentioned before, the issue with the card, I think, is the card quality of the cards that you hit on average. But the cool thing, if you play also Discovery, of course, is that you have a clip here, that you then maybe have the option to sort of combo off, because each time when you play a goblin, or of course also when you attack, but in particular when you play a goblin, you get to draw a card, and then you can maybe like chain enough goblins with that kind of effect together to then win right away. You can kind of like have the nut hit, of course, with Skirk Prospector. I have this in here, like even if the opponent has quite a strong board state like the Atraxa, you can then still pump a ton of mana into your Battle Cry Goblin, and then choose to, in particular, sacrifice the creature that gets blocked by a lifelink creature. But yeah, it's just having Influx Array in play and also having Discovery then allows you to play goblins right away when you play Discovery, and then kind of like allows you to chain a ton of goblins together, even like the following turns, because the reduction of course is then even better, right? But I think this is just to win more. Just having Discovery in play successfully I think is enough to win. And this card on its own, I'm just not too high about it. I might be wrong, this might be maybe better, but I'm not so sure about it. And notably, maybe also you have the artillery enthusiasts in here, so you can like get rid of a Twinshot Sniper, finding your array. You can get rid of a Squee. It's a discard effect, so that's nice to put it into the graveyard. Find your Crucible or find your Fable, which is nice. Also the extra cards of the array, like the bad ones, like random 2-drops in particular, you can then turn into those, which is really cool. So that's why I have this card in here. But yeah, the like base idea with the 1-drops in this version was to allow you to go through the deck even more, right? You have Trap Finder to thin your deck, you have Ronin to thin your deck here as a 4-off, you have the Enthusiast. So I think this is a way to go like a lot more on the Discovery and also Influx array kind of thing and make the deck really small. Of course, you have still the Crucius and the Fable, finding your pieces and maybe even like sort of combo off. But I don't think it is as good as the other Grixis version, but I tried it. It's still a nice deck. But yeah, those two are my two approaches to Goblins and Alchemy best of 3. Of course, you can also play this in best of 1 and then maybe change some of the mentioned sideboard cards for aggro decks in the main deck. But of course, then you lose out on some of the Goblins, which is something you don't want in particular. And the Twinshot Sniper then makes a lot of sense to bring, by the way. But yeah, I think decks like this are especially, of course, the mid-range deck, but especially aggressive decks are always interesting to play in best of 3 because often they are just not ready for it, especially in game 1, where often you can just kind of steal games. So yeah, now I think it's time to hop into some of those games. I'm gonna start with the mono red one, which I think makes out the most of the games. In the end, I have two matches for the Grixis one versus Wat, Anvil, Atraxa, Reanimator, and the other I think versus Chant, or more like 4-color mid-range, both played by I think quite good players, and the deck lists are very strong. And yeah, I don't know if it's a win or a lose, but I think the games were quite good. And yeah, I think now it's enough of the talking, and yeah, see you soon guys, bye bye.
Fight the good fight. Actually, fight all the fights. Look at us. We are tough. Take that, you fiend!
Right on schedule. Let's make this snappy. I'm busy. May the best mage win. Give it your best shot, adventurers. Don't come any closer. Don't come any closer. If you weren't impressed before, you better be now.